For most of the time our species has existed, the word grandparent would have described almost no one. In small Paleolithic groups, shaped by injury, childbirth, infection, and unstable food supply, many adults did not survive long enough to see their own children reach maturity, let alone watch a second generation grow. Today, the presence of grandparents feels stable and ordinary, woven into family memory, childcare, and identity. Yet for the vast majority of human history, multi-generational families were rare, not typical. If our species evolved for nearly 200,000 years with few people living long enough to become grandparents, what does that absence reveal about our bodies, our societies, and the long arc of time behind the question, why did 80% of human history have no grandparents? For most of the 200,000 years that Homo sapiens has existed, life unfolded inside small bands, rarely larger than a few dozen individuals, moving through open grasslands, woodland edges, river valleys, and seasonal coasts. In these environments, the measure of a life was not counted in decades the way we count today, but in survival from one dry season to the next, from one winter to the next migration. When modern readers hear that the average lifespan in pre-agricultural societies may have hovered somewhere around 30 years, it can sound as if most people simply died at 30. That image is misleading. The number itself hides a deeper structure, one that directly shapes our central question about grandparents. In early human populations, the average was pulled downward not because every adult died young, but because so many infants and children never reached adulthood. Mortality in the first years of life was high, often extremely high by modern standards. A group could lose multiple children in a single season due to infection, dehydration, or injury. When those early deaths are included in the calculation, the statistical average compresses sharply. Yet even after accounting for this, the proportion of individuals who survived into what we would call old age remained limited. In the ecological conditions that shaped our species, living long enough to see one's own children reproduce was possible, but it was not the dominant pattern. To understand why this matters, we must return to the demographic structure of those small bands. Imagine a group of 30 individuals. Several are children under 5, a few are adolescents. A cluster of adults are in their 20s and 30s, the primary reproductive and foraging years. Perhaps 1 or 2 individuals have crossed into their 40s. Fewer still approach 50. Each additional decade beyond that becomes increasingly rare. The environment did not simply test strength, it tested endurance against cumulative risk. Repeated minor injuries from hunting, untreated infections from small wounds, dental wear that made chewing difficult, parasitic load, and fluctuating food supply all layered over time. In such a setting, survival was uneven. Some individuals with resilient constitutions and strong social support could live longer than the average suggests. Archaeological evidence from skeletal remains does show individuals who reached advanced ages for their time, with signs of healed fractures and degenerative joint changes. Their presence reminds us that longevity was biologically possible within our species long before modern medicine. However, rarity is the key. A possibility does not define a norm. When we look at population models reconstructed from ethnographic studies of recent hunter-gatherers and from paleodemographic analysis of burial sites, a pattern emerges. Even in relatively stable foraging societies, the percentage of individuals surviving past 50 was modest. For a grandparent to exist, several conditions must align. A child must survive infancy. That child must reach reproductive age. They must reproduce successfully. Then the parent must remain alive long enough to overlap with the grandchild's early years. Each step carries risk. Multiply those risks together in a high mortality environment, and the overlap between 3 living generations becomes statistically fragile. This fragility shaped the social world in which our species evolved. Most children grew up surrounded by parents, siblings, cousins, and perhaps one aging elder, but not within large, stable networks of multiple elderly relatives. The structure of time within a band was compressed toward youth and early adulthood. If we trace this demographic shape back to the origins of Homo sapiens in Africa, emerging roughly 300,000 years ago, we see that for the overwhelming majority of that span, survival curves were steep at the beginning and tapered gradually with age. The idea of a population pyramid heavily weighted toward the young is not a modern abstraction. It reflects the lived biological reality of early humans. In such a pyramid, the top where grandparents would stand was narrow. This does not mean grandparents never existed. It means they were statistically uncommon enough that their presence could not define the baseline structure of human family life. When we say that 80% of human history had no grandparents, we are pointing to this long demographic imbalance, rooted in environment, biology, and risk. The absence is not a dramatic event, but a quiet statistical truth embedded in the earliest chapters of our species' story. If we slow down and look more closely at how lifespan is calculated, a quieter pattern begins to appear. The figure, often cited for prehistoric life expectancy, somewhere near 30 years, is not a ceiling but an average pulled downward by the vulnerability of early childhood. In small Paleolithic groups, birth itself carried risk. Without sterile tools, antibiotics, or surgical intervention, complications during delivery could end a life quickly. Even when birth was successful, the first years remained uncertain. Diarrheal disease from contaminated water, respiratory infections in cold seasons, and simple malnutrition during lean months could take children before their 5th year. In demographic terms, this creates what researchers describe as a steep early mortality curve. When many individuals die before reaching maturity, the arithmetic mean collapses, even if a subset of adults lives much longer. For our central question, this matters because the presence of grandparents depends not only on how long one person lives, but on whether multiple generations survive in sequence. Imagine a young woman in a hunter-gatherer band around 40,000 years ago. If she survives childbirth in her late teens or early 20s, and her child survives infancy, that child may not reproduce until their own late teens or 20s. By then, the original mother might be in her 40s. To overlap with a grandchild's early childhood, she would need to survive into her late 40s or 50s. Biologically possible, yes. Common, no. Each generation compresses the window further. If the second generation delays reproduction even slightly due to food scarcity or social conditions, the overlap shrinks again. This chain of probabilities is rooted in the ecological realities that shaped early Homo sapiens. Seasonal mobility meant constant exposure to varied climates. Cuts from stone tools or animal bones could become infected. Teeth, worn down by grit in food and the absence of dental care, often deteriorated by midlife, making chewing difficult and weakening the body's resilience. Skeletal remains from Upper Paleolithic sites show individuals with degenerative joint disease and healed fractures, evidence that some people did live long enough to accumulate age-related wear, yet the proportion remains small compared to younger adults. Population models derived from archaeological cemeteries suggest that while individuals in their 40s were not extraordinary, those clearly beyond 50 were far fewer. In a group of 30 or 40 individuals, one elder might stand out precisely because they were uncommon. The social memory of such a person could be strong, but numerically they did not form a stable, wide layer in the population structure. To understand why this shapes the rarity of grandparents, consider the concept of generational overlap. In modern industrial societies, it is common for 4 generations to coexist: child, parent, grandparent, sometimes even great-grandparent. This layered structure feels natural because reduced infant mortality and extended adult longevity create broad horizontal bands in the population pyramid. In early human societies, the pyramid was steep and narrow at the top. Even if an individual reached 50, there was no guarantee that their children and grandchildren would both be alive simultaneously. Mortality could remove any link in the chain. From the perspective of evolutionary biology, natural selection operates most strongly on traits that affect survival to reproductive age and successful reproduction. Traits influencing survival decades after reproduction exert weaker selective pressure. In an environment where many individuals did not survive long beyond child-rearing years, there was limited evolutionary reinforcement for maintaining bodily systems into advanced age. Longevity beyond reproduction was not irrelevant, but it was not the primary driver of adaptation. This subtle shift in selective pressure contributes to the demographic shape we see repeated across millennia. Returning to the deep timeline of our species, stretching back hundreds of thousands of years in Africa before dispersal across Eurasia, we find that the structural conditions remain similar: high early mortality, moderate adult survival, limited elderly representation. The rarity of grandparents was not due to a single catastrophe or short-lived crisis. It was embedded in the steady background of everyday risk. When we speak of 80% of human history, we are referring to this vast span in which generational overlap was statistically thin. The family as a 3-generation unit was possible, but it was not the demographic default. To see more clearly why grandparents were uncommon across most of human history, it helps to imagine the full demographic shape of an early human band, not as a list of ages, but as a living structure moving through time. In small foraging groups, population size remained relatively stable because resources were limited. If too many infants survived during a period of abundance, mobility and food pressure would increase strain on the group. If too few survived, the band risked shrinking. Over thousands of generations, this balance produced a population pyramid heavily weighted toward the young. Children and adolescents formed a broad base. Adults in their 20s and 30s formed the central working layer. Above them, the numbers thinned. This was not because humans were incapable of aging, but because cumulative risk steadily removed individuals before they could form a wide elderly cohort. When skeletal assemblages from Paleolithic sites are analysed, researchers often observe an age distribution in which the majority of remains belong to individuals who died before or during their reproductive years. There are always exceptions, and those exceptions matter. Some skeletons show clear signs of advanced age, pronounced joint wear, tooth loss long before death, vertebral compression. These individuals demonstrate that survival into later decades was biologically achievable even in harsh environments. Yet their relative frequency remains low. The archaeological record does not show dense layers of elderly individuals dominating burial grounds. Instead, it reflects a pattern consistent with high early mortality and moderate adult survival. This demographic reality shapes generational timing. In early Homo sapiens populations, the average age at first reproduction was likely younger than in most modern societies. Puberty may have occurred slightly later due to nutritional stress, but social pressures and ecological conditions often encouraged reproduction once physical maturity was reached. When reproduction begins in the late teens or early 20s, the possibility of becoming a grandparent in one's 40s theoretically increases. However, this theoretical possibility must compete with the ongoing background risks of infection, trauma, childbirth complications, and seasonal scarcity. Survival into one's 40s was not rare in absolute terms, but survival beyond that threshold, while maintaining the physical capacity to support or interact with grandchildren, narrowed significantly. To overlap with a grandchild who has survived infancy, an individual must remain alive through at least 2 full reproductive cycles. In a setting where mortality was distributed unevenly across the lifespan, each decade beyond early adulthood reduced the number of individuals present. From the perspective of population structure, this creates what demographers describe as a compressed generational overlap. Instead of 3 broad layers coexisting comfortably, the uppermost layer remains thin and unstable. This pattern likely characterized most of the 200,000 years since Homo sapiens emerged in Africa. Even during periods of relative climatic stability, such as interglacial phases, the absence of medical intervention meant that minor injuries could escalate. A broken bone that heals imperfectly might limit mobility. Reduced mobility affects food acquisition. Nutritional stress weakens immune response. Over time, these small vulnerabilities accumulate. The body, shaped by natural selection to prioritize growth and reproduction, did not evolve under conditions that consistently supported long post-reproductive lifespans for large proportions of the population. The result is not a dramatic narrative of constant early death, but a quiet statistical imbalance. In a band of 40 individuals, perhaps one elder stands as a living memory of earlier migrations. That person's presence would have been meaningful, even revered. Yet meaning does not equal frequency. The social fabric of early human groups was woven primarily from overlapping young and middle-aged adults, not from wide, stable networks of grandparents. When we extend this structure across tens of thousands of generations, covering roughly 80% of our species' existence, the pattern becomes steady rather than exceptional. The rarity of grandparents was not an anomaly. It was the baseline demographic condition from which modern longevity later diverged. When we shift our attention from adult survival to the earliest years of life, the demographic structure becomes clearer. In small foraging societies, the most fragile point in the human lifespan was not middle age but infancy and early childhood. Anthropological studies of recent hunter-gatherer populations, often used cautiously as comparative models for earlier Homo sapiens, show that mortality rates before the age of 5 were far higher than those seen in modern industrial societies. Without vaccines, antibiotics, or stable food storage, a simple infection could become fatal. Diarrheal disease from contaminated water sources, respiratory infections during cold nights, and complications from weaning could all narrow the path to adulthood. This early vulnerability does not merely reduce the number of surviving children, it reshapes the entire population pyramid. When a significant portion of a generation dies before reaching maturity, the statistical average lifespan drops sharply. Yet the deeper effect is structural. Fewer children surviving means fewer future parents. Fewer parents surviving into older adulthood means fewer opportunities for generational overlap. The presence of grandparents depends on a chain of survival that begins at birth. If that chain breaks frequently at its first link, the uppermost layer of elders remains thin. In early human environments, birth spacing also played a role. In mobile hunter-gatherer groups, mothers often breastfed for extended periods, sometimes several years. This natural spacing mechanism reduced the number of simultaneous dependents, but also meant that each surviving child represented a substantial investment of time and energy. If one child died, the emotional and demographic impact was significant. Reproduction was not continuous and dense as it later became in agricultural societies. Instead, it was paced by ecological constraints. This pacing limited population growth and kept group sizes small, reinforcing the narrow shape of the generational pyramid. To imagine the effect across deep time, consider a band living perhaps 60,000 years ago in Eastern Africa or later in Eurasia after dispersal. A child born into the group must first survive infancy. If successful, they must navigate childhood hazards, accidental injury near water, burns from fire, encounters with animals, seasonal shortages. If they reach adolescence and reproduce in their late teens or early 20s, their own child faces the same set of risks. For a grandparent to exist, at least 2 consecutive generations must pass through these hazards intact. In environments where early mortality was common, the probability of maintaining 3 living generations at once declines. Paleodemographic reconstructions from burial sites reinforce this pattern. Although sample sizes are often limited and preservation uneven, many assemblages show a concentration of deaths in infancy and young adulthood. The relative scarcity of individuals clearly past 50 suggests that the elderly were present but not numerous. This aligns with life table models built from ethnographic analogies, which estimate that in many pre-modern populations, only a minority survived into what we would classify as old age. The central point is not that no one became a grandparent. It is that the demographic weight of early mortality kept the generational ladder short. When the base of the pyramid is repeatedly thinned by child deaths, the layers above cannot widen. This pattern likely persisted for the overwhelming majority of the roughly 200,000 years since our species emerged. Only in the last small fraction of that timeline did reductions in child mortality dramatically expand the pool of individuals who could both reproduce and then live long enough to see grandchildren. In earlier epochs, the fragility of early life quietly limited the existence of grandparents. The absence was not defined by sudden catastrophe, but by the steady arithmetic of survival probabilities embedded in the environments where Homo sapiens first evolved. When we examine early mortality more closely, the effect becomes cumulative rather than isolated. A single child death alters one family's story, but repeated losses across a small band reshape the entire generational map. In mobile foraging societies, groups often consisted of 20 to 40 individuals. Within such a modest population, the death of even a few infants in one season could reduce the size of an entire age cohort. This thinning does not remain confined to childhood. Years later, that smaller cohort produces fewer adults of reproductive age. Fewer reproductive adults produce fewer children. Each wave of early mortality narrows the demographic funnel through which later generations must pass. In demographic modeling, this creates what is sometimes described as a cohort bottleneck. For grandparents to become common, there must be enough surviving children in one generation to ensure that a substantial number reach adulthood, reproduce, and then remain alive into later decades. In early Homo sapiens populations, the sequence was fragile. A child who survived infancy still faced adolescence, a period of growing independence but also increased exposure to risk. Hunting, gathering in unfamiliar terrain, and travelling between seasonal camps all carried hazards. Injury without medical intervention could become fatal. Even minor infections, trivial by modern standards, could escalate in environments without antimicrobial treatment. These risks were not catastrophic events but steady background conditions. Over tens of thousands of years, this steady background shaped the age distribution of human groups. Archaeological evidence provides indirect support for this structure. In Upper Paleolithic burial sites, many skeletons belong to juveniles or young adults. Preservation biases complicate interpretation, yet repeated findings across regions suggest a pattern consistent with high early mortality. Meanwhile, individuals clearly past middle age appear, but not in numbers large enough to form a broad, stable elder class. The archaeological record does not reveal villages dominated by elderly individuals in deep prehistory. Instead, it suggests populations centered around youth and active adulthood. This demographic structure influences generational overlap in subtle ways. Suppose that in a band of 30 individuals, 8 are children under 10, 10 are adolescents and young adults, 8 are adults in their 20s and 30s, 3 are in their 40s, and perhaps one individual approaches 50. Even if that elder survives into their early 50s, the probability that both their child and grandchild are alive simultaneously remains limited by the survival rates of the younger cohorts. If the elder's child died young, or reproduced late due to ecological constraints, the chain breaks. The existence of a grandparent depends not only on longevity, but on synchronized survival across generations. From an evolutionary perspective, selection pressures operate most strongly on survival to reproduction and successful child-rearing. Traits that extend life well beyond the reproductive window exert weaker influence unless they significantly enhance the survival of descendants. In early human settings where mortality frequently removed individuals before or shortly after reproductive years, the selective reinforcement of prolonged post-reproductive lifespan would have been modest. Some anthropologists argue that older individuals contributed knowledge, social stability, and childcare support, but even these potential advantages function within the boundaries of survival probability. The key point remains demographic. When early mortality trims the base of the population pyramid repeatedly, the upper layers cannot expand. Across the roughly 200,000 years of our species' history, long before sanitation, vaccination, or modern medicine reduced child mortality, this trimming occurred generation after generation. The result was a population structure in which grandparents existed but did not define the norm. The absence of a large elder cohort was not a cultural choice. It was a structural outcome of survival patterns rooted in environment and biology. When early mortality repeats across many generations, it does more than reduce numbers. It shapes the rhythm of time within a community. In small hunter-gatherer bands, time was experienced through growth, maturity, and succession. If a significant portion of each birth cohort failed to reach adulthood, the generational ladder remained short. Instead of 3 broad layers coexisting with stability, there were often only 2 strong layers at any given moment: children and their parents. The third layer, those who might become grandparents, remain narrow and vulnerable to disruption. This pattern can be understood through life table reconstruction. Demographers build models estimating how many individuals in a hypothetical population survive to each age. In many pre-modern life, tables derived from ethnographic and archaeological data, survival drops steeply in the first years, then levels somewhat through young adulthood, and declines again as age increases. If out of 100 births, only 60 or 70 reach adulthood, and of those perhaps 20 survive into their 40s, the pool of potential grandparents is already constrained before reproduction in the next generation is even considered. To sustain 3 overlapping generations, the survival curve must be sufficiently broad at each stage. In early Homo sapiens populations, this breadth was limited. Environmental conditions played a constant role. Climate fluctuations during the Pleistocene repeatedly altered landscapes across Africa and Eurasia, droughts reduced plant availability. Colder periods altered animal migration patterns. Groups had to move, adapt, or compete. Such instability did not necessarily cause mass extinction within bands, but it reinforced background mortality. Nutritional stress weakens immune systems. Weakened immune systems increase susceptibility to infection. Each small pressure compounds across decades. The body, adapted for mobility and reproduction, was not supported by a medical safety net that could buffer cumulative damage. This cumulative effect is visible in skeletal remains showing signs of chronic stress, such as enamel hypoplasia in teeth, indicating episodes of malnutrition or illness during childhood. These markers suggest that many individuals who did survive into adulthood had already endured physiological strain. Strain in early life can influence later survival probability, further narrowing the chance of extended longevity. From a structural perspective, this means that even those who became parents carried the imprint of earlier vulnerability. The chain required for grandparenthood survive infancy, reach adulthood, reproduce, and then remain alive through the next generation's infancy had multiple fragile points. If we stretch this pattern across approximately 300,000 years since the emergence of Homo sapiens in Africa, the scale becomes clearer. For perhaps the first 200,000 years, and for most groups even later, reductions in child mortality were minimal. There were no systematic interventions to prevent infection or ensure consistent food supply beyond social cooperation and knowledge. While cooperation undoubtedly improved survival odds, it did not eliminate the steep early mortality curve. In such a context, the absence of a large grandparent generation was not dramatic or visible as a crisis. It was simply the demographic background. Children were more likely to grow up surrounded by siblings and peers than by multiple elderly relatives. An older individual might be respected for accumulated knowledge, yet statistically they represented a small fraction of the living population. When we consider that this pattern persisted for roughly 80% of human history, the idea of grandparents as a common and stable presence becomes historically recent. The generational ladder was often 2 rungs high rather than 3. This structure was built quietly, not by a single cause, but by the steady repetition of early mortality shaping each cohort before it could extend fully into old age. If early mortality narrowed the base of the generational ladder, the structure was further shaped by how the human body evolved under constant environmental pressure. Homo sapiens did not emerge in conditions designed for long, protected lives. Our species formed within the ecological realities of the Pleistocene. Fluctuating climates, mobile food sources, exposure to predators, and repeated physical exertion. In this setting, natural selection acted most strongly on traits that increased the probability of surviving to reproductive age and successfully raising offspring through early childhood. Survival decades beyond that window exerted comparatively weaker influence on gene frequencies across generations. The body we carry today still reflects those priorities. Bone density, muscle distribution, immune response, metabolic flexibility all were shaped to navigate environments where mobility and reproductive timing mattered more than prolonged post-reproductive lifespan. This does not mean that aging was irrelevant. It means that evolutionary pressure did not consistently reward individuals for living long past the age at which their children reached independence. From a biological perspective, aging represents the gradual accumulation of cellular damage. DNA replication errors, oxidative stress, and immune decline occur across decades. In modern societies, medicine and nutrition buffer many of these processes, allowing large numbers of people to survive into their 70s and 80s. In early human environments, these buffers were absent. A minor infection could overwhelm an aging immune system. A fracture that might heal with modern orthopedic care could permanently reduce mobility. Reduced mobility meant reduced ability to gather food or keep pace with seasonal movement. In small bands dependent on cooperation, individuals with declining physical capacity might still be supported socially, yet the physical realities of the environment impose limits. Skeletal remains from Paleolithic contexts frequently show healed injuries, indicating that care and social bonds existed. Individuals survive broken limbs or trauma long enough for bone to knit back together. This demonstrates cooperation and compassion within early human groups. However, healing does not eliminate long-term consequences. A leg that healed imperfectly might shorten stride or increase pain with age. Joint degeneration accumulates. Teeth worn down by abrasive particles in stone-ground plant foods or grit from meat processing often deteriorated significantly by midlife. Dental abscesses without antibiotics could become systemic infections. These physiological vulnerabilities interacted with the demographic structure already thinned by early mortality. To become a grandparent, an individual needed not only to survive infancy and reach adulthood, but also to withstand decades of cumulative biological wear. In evolutionary terms, selection pressure weakens after reproduction because genes have already been passed on. Traits that enhance late-life survival can persist if they also improve earlier reproductive success. Yet they are not consistently amplified if most individuals do not survive into old age. Over roughly 200,000 years of human existence before large-scale reductions in mortality, this pattern likely limited the proportion of the population reaching advanced age. Even in relatively stable climatic windows, the absence of medical intervention meant that biological aging unfolded without protective infrastructure. When we consider the body as it evolved, we see a system optimized for resilience through reproductive years rather than indefinite extension beyond them. This does not imply that elders were absent or unimportant. It suggests that their numbers remained limited within the overall population structure. The rarity of grandparents, therefore, is tied not only to child mortality, but to the evolutionary design of a body shaped by environments where long post-reproductive lifespan was possible, but not broadly reinforced across generations. When we continue examining the human body through the lens of deep time, a quieter principle of evolution becomes visible. Natural selection does not design organisms for maximum lifespan in abstract terms. It favors traits that increase reproductive success within the specific environmental window in which a species lives. For early Homo sapiens, that window was defined by mobility, food acquisition, cooperation, and the successful survival of offspring through vulnerable early years. Once reproduction had occurred and children reached a level of partial independence, the evolutionary pressure to maintain perfect physiological function began to weaken. This principle, sometimes described in evolutionary biology as the declining force of selection with age, helps explain why aging processes accumulate gradually rather than being fully prevented. In environments without consistent medical support, small physiological declines carried larger consequences. Immune function, for example, naturally shifts across the lifespan. In youth and early adulthood, the immune system is typically robust, capable of responding rapidly to pathogens common in a given region. Over time, immune regulation changes. In a setting with repeated exposure to parasites, bacteria, and viruses, cumulative infections can leave lasting marks on the body. Chronic inflammation may increase. Energy that might otherwise support tissue repair is redirected towards survival. Without antibiotics or antiseptic procedures, wounds from everyday activities, cutting meat, shaping stone, gathering plants, could become systemic threats. The body's capacity to repair itself remains remarkable, yet not infinite. The same applies to skeletal and muscular systems. Foraging required walking long distances, carrying loads, and climbing uneven terrain. These activities build strength in early adulthood but also contribute to joint wear over decades. Archaeological skeletons frequently display osteoarthritis in knees, hips, and vertebrae among individuals who survived into later life. Such evidence shows both endurance and cost. Degenerative changes do not necessarily prevent survival, but they may reduce efficiency, speed, and capacity for sustained labor. In a mobile group, diminished efficiency can affect access to food and protection. Even when supported socially, an individual's biological limits shape how long they remain active participants in daily subsistence. Another layer of vulnerability lies in dental health. In prehistoric contexts, teeth often show extreme wear from gritty foods and the absence of refined processing. Enamel erosion, cracked molars, and infections are common findings. Once tooth loss or abscesses occurred, chewing became painful and inefficient. Nutritional intake could decline precisely at the age when the body required more support to counteract aging processes. Without soft, processed foods or medical dental intervention, late-life malnutrition could compound existing weaknesses. These biological realities must be placed within the timeline of human origins. From the emergence of anatomically modern humans in Africa through their spread across diverse ecosystems, the body faced constant adaptation challenges. Climatic shifts during the Pleistocene imposed cycles of abundance and scarcity. Genetic adaptations enhanced survival within these cycles, yet none systematically insulated large portions of the population from age-related decline. To become a grandparent required not only surviving childhood and reproduction, but also maintaining enough physiological integrity to endure cumulative damage. In a world where the environment continuously tested physical resilience, only a fraction of individuals crossed that threshold. The rarity of grandparents, therefore, reflects the intersection between evolutionary priorities and biological wear. The human body was capable of longevity, but it was not universally protected against the incremental costs of survival in demanding environments. Across most of our species' history, those incremental costs quietly limited the number of people who lived long enough to stand within a third living generation. To complete the biological picture, it is necessary to consider how energy allocation shaped the lifespan of early humans. Every organism distributes limited energy among growth, maintenance, and reproduction. In evolutionary ecology, this balance is often described as a life history strategy. For Homo sapiens, the strategy that proved successful across most of our species' existence emphasized extended childhood learning, high parental investment, and relatively early reproduction compared to modern industrial norms. This combination allowed knowledge to accumulate within a generation and be passed on efficiently. Yet it also meant that significant metabolic resources were directed toward gestation, lactation, and child-rearing during early and middle adulthood. Energy invested in reproduction is energy not invested in long-term cellular repair. In environments where calories fluctuated seasonally, this trade-off became more pronounced. A woman who bore multiple children over her lifetime, breastfeeding each for extended periods, experienced repeated physiological strain. Pregnancy alters immune function, calcium balance, and overall metabolic load. Without consistent nutritional surplus, these repeated cycles could weaken the body over decades. The same applies to men whose roles required sustained physical exertion in hunting and territorial movement. Continuous high-energy expenditure maintains survival in youth, but accumulates cost over time. The human body evolved to handle these costs well enough to ensure generational continuity, yet not to eliminate them entirely. This pattern is visible in comparative primate biology. Humans are unusual among primates in having relatively long post-reproductive lifespans, especially among females. However, this longevity must be understood in relative terms. Compared to chimpanzees in the wild, humans can live longer. Yet in early human populations, the proportion of individuals who actually reached those extended years remained modest. Longevity potential does not equal longevity prevalence. Genetic capacity for a longer life may have existed, but environmental constraints limited how often it was realized. The fossil and skeletal record supports this interpretation. Some Paleolithic individuals lived long enough to show advanced degenerative changes in vertebrae and joints, clear evidence of survival beyond prime reproductive years. Their existence suggests that aging individuals were not immediately removed from the population. Social cooperation likely played a role in their survival. Nevertheless, these cases stand out precisely because they are not numerous. In most assemblages, the distribution of adult ages thins progressively after the 30s and 40s. This thinning reflects the accumulated biological costs of survival in demanding conditions. Across the vast timeline stretching back to the earliest Homo sapiens in Africa, these life history trade-offs shaped population structure. Energy devoted to producing and protecting offspring ensured species continuity. Energy reserved for long-term maintenance beyond the reproductive window was comparatively limited. As a result, although some individuals crossed into advanced age, they did so against a background where cumulative wear steadily reduced numbers. To become a grandparent required navigating not only childhood hazards and reproductive risks, but also decades of metabolic strain. The biological system did not forbid this outcome, but neither did it consistently reinforce it for large proportions of the population. When we consider that roughly 80% of human history unfolded under these life history constraints, the rarity of grandparents becomes less surprising. It reflects a long-standing balance between reproduction and repair, shaped by environment and encoded in our evolutionary past. To understand why grandparents were uncommon for most of human history, we must look closely at the risks surrounding childbirth and maternal survival. In early Homo sapiens societies, reproduction was essential for group continuity, yet it carried substantial danger. Human childbirth is biologically complex. The size of the infant brain, combined with the structure of the pelvis shaped by upright walking, creates a narrow margin during delivery. In modern settings, surgical intervention, antibiotics, and sterile techniques dramatically reduce maternal mortality. In prehistoric environments, these protections did not exist. Prolonged labor, obstructed birth, postpartum hemorrhage, and infection could quickly become fatal. Even when the mother survived the immediate event, complications could leave lasting physical consequences. In mobile hunter-gatherer groups, a woman often began bearing children in her late teens or early 20s. Over her reproductive years, she might experience multiple pregnancies spaced by extended breastfeeding. Each pregnancy altered her body's mineral reserves, immune balance, and overall strength. Calcium was drawn into fetal bone development. Iron was required in increased amounts. Nutritional stress during lean seasons compounded these demands. Without consistent surplus, recovery between births could be incomplete. The cumulative toll of repeated childbirth under fluctuating environmental conditions increased vulnerability later in life. For a woman to become a grandmother, she needed to survive not only her own childhood and adolescence, but also multiple pregnancies and the physically demanding years of early child-rearing. Then she needed to remain alive long enough to overlap with her daughter's or son's reproductive cycle. In environments where maternal mortality was significant, this chain frequently broke at its second link. If a mother died during or shortly after childbirth, the generational ladder shortened immediately. Even when mortality rates were not extreme in any single year, the steady risk across decades reduced the proportion of women who reached advanced age. Skeletal remains from prehistoric contexts sometimes reveal pelvic injuries, spinal stress from carrying loads, and signs of nutritional deficiency. While direct evidence of childbirth complications is difficult to detect archaeologically, demographic reconstructions consistently indicate higher maternal mortality in pre-modern populations compared to modern societies. Ethnographic data from historical populations without medical infrastructure show that childbirth was one of the leading causes of death for women of reproductive age. There is no reason to assume early Homo sapiens were exempt from similar risks. This reality shapes the demographic structure of early bands. In a group of limited size, the death of one reproductive age woman affected not only her existing children, but the potential for future generational overlap. If her daughter survived and later bore children, the absence of the mother meant that the role of grandmother was never realized in that lineage. Multiply this scenario across thousands of years, and the pattern becomes structural rather than incidental. The generational chain required for grandparenthood depended heavily on maternal survival across multiple decades. When we place this within the deep timeline of human origins, stretching back hundreds of thousands of years in Africa before global dispersal, the effect becomes more pronounced. For the overwhelming majority of that time, there were no surgical procedures to resolve obstructed labor, no antiseptic practices to prevent infection, no transfusions to counter hemorrhage. Survival relied on the resilience of the body and the support of the group. Support could increase odds, but it could not eliminate biological risk. The rarity of grandparents is therefore closely tied to the fragile survival window surrounding childbirth. In the absence of medical intervention, the path from mother to grandmother remained narrow. Beyond the immediate danger of childbirth itself, the broader conditions surrounding maternal life in early human societies further narrowed the path toward becoming a grandmother. Reproduction did not occur in isolation from environment. It unfolded within landscapes defined by mobility, fluctuating food availability, and continuous physical demand. A pregnant woman in a Paleolithic band did not withdraw into a protected medical space. She continued to move with the group, gather plant foods, process animal carcasses, and care for existing children. Even with social support, daily survival required effort. This steady exertion during pregnancy increased physiological strain, particularly when nutritional intake was unpredictable. Seasonal scarcity was not rare in Pleistocene ecosystems. Climatic oscillations altered rainfall patterns, plant productivity, and animal migration routes. In lean months, caloric intake could drop below optimal levels. For a pregnant or lactating woman, reduced energy availability directly affects immune function and tissue repair. Repeated cycles of pregnancy and breastfeeding, layered onto such environmental variability, created a long arc of cumulative stress. The body's remarkable adaptability allowed many women to endure these cycles. Yet endurance does not guarantee long-term resilience. When nutritional reserves are repeatedly drawn down without sustained surplus, recovery becomes partial rather than complete. This pattern can be inferred from skeletal markers of physiological stress, such as enamel hypoplasia and porous bone structures, which indicate episodes of nutritional deficiency or illness during development and adulthood. While these markers do not specify maternal mortality directly, they reveal a landscape in which biological systems were regularly challenged. In such a context, the probability of surviving into advanced age declines incrementally. Another factor shaping maternal survival was infection. Childbirth exposes internal tissues to potential pathogens. In environments without antiseptic practice, even minor contamination could lead to postpartum infection. Ethnographic data from pre-industrial societies suggest that puerperal infections historically accounted for a significant portion of maternal deaths. Although exact rates in early Homo sapiens populations cannot be measured precisely, the absence of medical intervention strongly implies elevated risk compared to modern conditions. Each maternal death shortened the generational chain. A woman who died in her 20s or 30s could not become a grandmother decades later. Even when a mother survived childbirth, the demands of raising multiple children in close succession limited the margin for later life survival. Children required constant attention, protection, and nourishment. Extended breastfeeding, while spacing births and protecting infant survival, placed metabolic demands on the mother for several years at a time. Over the span of a reproductive life, this repeated investment accumulated cost. In small bands, numbering perhaps 30 individuals, the loss of even one experienced adult woman had demographic consequences. It reduced the pool of individuals who might later occupy the narrow upper tier of the population pyramid. The structure of generational overlap depended heavily on maternal endurance across decades. When we extend this pattern across the hundreds of thousands of years since the emergence of Homo sapiens, the scale becomes clear. For roughly 80% of our species' history, childbirth occurred without surgical backup, without antibiotics, without transfusions, and without the nutritional stability that later agricultural systems sometimes provided. The path from young mother to grandmother required surviving not only individual pregnancies, but an entire reproductive lifespan embedded in fluctuating environments. Each pregnancy was a step in a long probabilistic chain. Many women completed that chain, many did not. Across deep time, the cumulative effect of these risks kept the proportion of grandmothers modest within the overall population structure. The rarity of grandparents was not solely a matter of aging. It was intertwined with the sustained vulnerability of maternal life. The final link in this maternal chain lies not only in survival through childbirth and child-rearing, but in the timing between generations. Even if a woman survived multiple pregnancies and reached her 40s, the emergence of a grandchild required that her own children reproduce while she was still alive and physically capable of continued participation in group life. In early human societies, the age at first reproduction was influenced by nutritional status, social structure, and ecological stability. While biological maturity might be reached in the mid to late teens, the actual timing of reproduction could vary depending on resource availability and group dynamics. If food was scarce or mobility high, reproduction might be delayed slightly. Each delay, even by a few years, shifted the window of generational overlap. Consider a simplified sequence within a Paleolithic band. A woman survives her own infancy and adolescence and bears her first child at around 20. That child, if surviving infancy and childhood, may reproduce at 20 as well. The earliest point at which the original mother could become a grandmother would then be around 40. Yet survival to 40 in prehistoric conditions, while not extraordinary, was far from guaranteed. To remain alive and relatively functional into the mid or late 40s required withstanding decades of physical strain, repeated pregnancies, and environmental uncertainty. If her child reproduced later, perhaps at 25 due to seasonal instability or social conditions, the generational overlap shifts again. Now the mother must survive into her mid-40s or 50s to experience grandmotherhood. With each additional year required, the statistical probability narrows. Archaeological and ethnographic evidence suggests that while some individuals certainly crossed these thresholds, they did so in limited numbers. The demographic pyramid of early Homo sapiens remained weighted toward younger adults. Even in relatively stable hunter-gatherer populations studied in more recent centuries, only a portion of women lived long enough to overlap substantially with grandchildren. In deeper prehistory, without even the modest technological buffers available in later eras, the proportion was likely similar or smaller. This pattern also interacts with interbirth intervals. Extended breastfeeding, common in mobile foraging groups, lengthened the time between births. While this practice protected infant survival and moderated population growth, it also meant that generations did not stack quickly. A woman who began reproducing at 20 and spaced births every 3 or 4 years might have her last child in her mid-30s. If that last child delayed reproduction slightly, the window for grandparent overlap narrowed further. The structure of time itself within early human life cycles limited how many decades could be shared across 3 living generations. Across the long arc of approximately 300,000 years since anatomically modern humans first appeared in Africa, these patterns repeated. The maternal body endured, adapted, and often survived. Yet the chain from birth to grandmotherhood required alignment across biology, environment, and timing. Any break shortened the ladder. When we speak of 80% of human history lacking grandparents as a common presence, we refer to this compounded fragility. Maternal mortality, environmental strain, and generational timing converge to keep the uppermost tier of the population pyramid narrow. Grandmothers existed, and their presence likely carried social significance. However, they did not form a broad, stable layer across most communities. The demographic structure of early Homo sapiens made grandmotherhood possible but statistically limited. The rarity was not abrupt or dramatic. It was embedded quietly in the timing of life itself. If we turn from biological probabilities to the physical traces left in the ground, another layer of evidence begins to clarify the rarity of grandparents. Archaeology does not record emotions or family roles directly. It preserves bone, sediment, fragments of habitation, and the slow imprint of time. Yet within these remains, age leaves signatures. Teeth wear down, joints erode, vertebrae compress. Long bones remodel in response to stress. By examining these markers, researchers can estimate the age at death of individuals found in burial sites or habitation layers. When these estimates are aggregated across sites from the Upper Paleolithic and earlier periods, a pattern emerges that aligns with demographic modeling. Many skeletons belong to infants, juveniles, and young adults. Fewer belong to individuals clearly beyond their 40s or 50s. This does not mean that elderly individuals were absent from early human communities. On the contrary, some skeletons reveal survival well into later decades. For example, certain remains from European Upper Paleolithic contexts show pronounced osteoarthritis, significant tooth loss, and healed fractures, all indicating long life. In some cases, individuals survived injuries that would have limited mobility, suggesting social support within the group. These findings demonstrate that aging was biologically and socially possible long before agriculture or medicine. However, the proportion of such individuals within excavated populations remains limited. Burial assemblages often contain a higher representation of younger individuals. Preservation bias must be considered, since infant bones are fragile and may not survive equally across sites. Even accounting for this, the overall age distribution reconstructed from many Paleolithic cemeteries suggests a thinning of numbers with advancing age. The uppermost tier of the demographic structure remains narrow. To understand how this connects to the absence of grandparents, it is important to translate age at death data into generational overlap. If only a modest percentage of adults survived beyond 40 or 50, then only a subset of those would have had children who themselves survived long enough to reproduce. Archaeological data cannot directly reveal whether a specific elder held a grandchild, but it can indicate how many individuals reached ages compatible with that possibility. In many early contexts, the number is small relative to the total population. This pattern stretches back across deep time. In African Middle Stone Age sites associated with early Homo sapiens, skeletal evidence is fragmentary but consistent with a demographic structure weighted toward youth. As humans dispersed into Eurasia, the environmental challenges changed, but the age profile remained similar. Climatic shifts during glacial and interglacial periods altered subsistence patterns, yet they did not create a sudden expansion of elderly cohorts. Across roughly 80% of human history, the archaeological record reflects populations in which elders were present but not numerous. The significance of this lies in scale. 1 or 2 elders in a band of 30 may carry cultural authority and memory. Their presence may influence decision-making or knowledge transmission, yet numerically they do not constitute a wide generational layer. The archaeological record, imperfect as it is, supports the demographic models already discussed. The scarcity of individuals reaching advanced age suggests that grandparents existed as valued exceptions rather than as a common structural feature of family life. When viewed across hundreds of thousands of years, these scattered skeletal traces reinforce the conclusion that 3-generation overlap was statistically limited. The Earth itself, through preserved bone and wear patterns, quietly confirms that longevity beyond reproductive years was possible, but not widespread in the earliest chapters of human history. Archaeological evidence about age is always indirect, and that indirectness matters for how carefully we interpret the past. Age at death estimates usually rely on patterns in teeth, bone growth, and joint surfaces. In children, the timing of tooth eruption and the fusion of growth plates provide relatively tight age ranges. In adults, the picture becomes less precise. Researchers look at tooth wear, changes in the pubic symphysis, pelvic joint surfaces, cranial suture closure, and degenerative changes in joints. These indicators are useful, but they come with uncertainty, especially after about 40 years of age, when skeletal aging markers tend to overlap. 2 individuals of the same chronological age may show different degrees of wear depending on activity, diet, and genetics. Because of this, when we say that an adult skeleton appears older, we are often speaking in broad categories rather than exact years. That uncertainty does not erase the pattern, but it does caution us against sharp claims. Another limitation is preservation. The archaeological record is not a census. Bodies decay, bones scatter, and many people were never buried in ways that left traceable remains. Infant and child bones are smaller and more fragile, which can lead to underrepresentation in some sites, even though child mortality was high. Older adults may also be underrepresented because their remains were treated differently, placed in locations not excavated or lost to erosion. The sample that survives is shaped by soil chemistry, water movement, scavenging, and later disturbance. This means any age distribution reconstructed from a cemetery or habitation area must be treated as a partial window, not the full population. Even so, when many different Paleolithic and early Holocene burial assemblages are considered together, a consistent impression emerges. The number of individuals who clearly reached advanced ages is typically smaller than the number of younger adults and juveniles. In a high-risk environment without medical intervention, many people would be expected to die before accumulating the unmistakable skeletal markers of later life. What matters for our question is that the archaeological record rarely suggests a large, stable layer of elders. Instead, it suggests that elders were present in some communities, sometimes living long enough to show extensive tooth loss, spinal compression, and arthritic joint remodeling, but they do not dominate the assemblages. Across the long span from our African beginnings into later migrations, that upper tier remains thin. In demographic terms, the top of the pyramid remains narrow. Burial itself adds another complication, because formal graves are not evenly distributed across all individuals. Some people may have been buried carefully because of social role or circumstances of death, while others may have been left in places that do not preserve well. Burial data therefore reflect culture as well as biology. Yet even when we grant these uncertainties, the repeated appearance of thin elder representation across many sites supports the broader demographic argument. 3 living generations at once would have been possible, but not common. This is where archaeology adds something unique. It provides evidence of rarity and care at the same time. Some older individuals show healed fractures and survival after serious injury, implying that others helped them during recovery. Some show tooth loss with signs of continued survival, suggesting that softer foods were shared or that social support compensated for reduced chewing ability. These traces do not tell us that a person held a grandchild, but they do tell us that long-lived individuals existed as real bodies in real communities, sometimes supported long enough to reach ages where grandparenthood could occur. The quiet conclusion is balanced. Elders were not absent, but they were not numerous enough to make grandparenthood a common expectation across most of human history. When the archaeological fragments are placed beside demographic reasoning, a quiet consistency begins to appear across regions and eras. From sites in Eastern Africa associated with early Homo sapiens to later Upper Paleolithic burials in Europe and Western Asia, the age profiles that can be reconstructed rarely suggest a population dominated by long-lived elders. Instead, they reveal a steady tapering of numbers as age increases. This tapering aligns with what we would expect in environments shaped by persistent risk and without sustained medical buffering. Even in cases where a burial ground shows several individuals who reach later decades, they stand within a broader context in which many others died young. To understand how this relates to the question of grandparents, it is helpful to translate skeletal age into generational probability. If a cemetery reveals that only a modest fraction of adults survived into their late 40s or beyond, then only that fraction could even potentially experience life as a grandparent. Among them, not all would have had children who survived and reproduced during their lifetime. The archaeological record cannot tell us directly how many grandchildren existed, yet it can tell us how many bodies reach the age compatible with such overlap. Across most Paleolithic contexts, that compatible group appears limited. This does not diminish the social importance of those who did survive longer. In some well-documented cases, older individuals show evidence of healed injuries that would have required assistance. A fractured limb that healed correctly suggests weeks or months of care. Severe tooth loss combined with survival indicates access to shared food and protection. These traces imply that older adults were not abandoned once their physical strength declined. Cooperation extended survival beyond what isolated biology might allow. However, cooperation does not erase mortality patterns entirely. It raises survival probabilities incrementally rather than transforming them wholesale. When we widen the lens to encompass the roughly 300,000 years since anatomically modern humans first appeared in Africa, the scale of repetition becomes striking. Generation after generation lived within ecological systems that limited the expansion of elderly cohorts. Even during relatively favorable climatic periods, life remained physically demanding. The demographic pyramid likely retained its steep base and narrow top for tens of thousands of years at a time. Only in the last small fraction of human history, particularly with the gradual reductions in mortality associated with agricultural intensification, improved sanitation, and later medical advances, did the upper layers broaden significantly. Archaeology thus serves as a long mirror reflecting the structure of human life before modern intervention. It shows that aging individuals were real and sometimes resilient, yet their numbers did not form a broad demographic plateau. The presence of a grandparent would have depended on a chain of survival events that remained statistically fragile across most of our species' existence. In the physical remains left behind, we see endurance, care, and adaptation. We also see limitation. The bones do not narrate absence dramatically, they reveal it quietly through proportion. The small number of individuals reaching advanced age across diverse sites reinforces the broader pattern. For the majority of human history, the structure of populations did not regularly support large, stable layers of grandparents. Among the few scientific ideas that directly connect longevity to human evolution, one of the most discussed is often called the grandmother hypothesis. It proposes that older women, even after they are no longer reproducing, may enhance the survival of their descendants by helping care for grandchildren. By gathering food, sharing knowledge, and supporting young mothers, they could increase the reproductive success of their daughters. Over time, this assistance might favor genes that allow women to live beyond menopause. The hypothesis draws attention to a distinctive feature of human biology. Compared to many other mammals, human females often experience a prolonged post-reproductive lifespan. This raises a question that intersects directly with our central theme. If grandmotherhood carries evolutionary value, Why were grandparents still uncommon for most of human history? To approach this carefully, it is important to distinguish between biological capacity and demographic prevalence. The grandmother hypothesis does not claim that all early human populations were filled with grandmothers. Instead, it suggests that even a modest number of older women could influence survival outcomes within small groups. In mobile hunter-gatherer settings, food acquisition required time and energy. A young mother balancing infant care with foraging might benefit from assistance. An older woman, no longer nursing her own infants, could contribute calories gathered from plant foods or shellfish. Ethnographic studies of some recent foraging societies, such as the Hadza of Tanzania, have shown that grandmothers can play a measurable role in child nutrition and survival. These observations provide a plausible model for how post-reproductive longevity might offer selective advantages. Yet there are limits to how far such models can be extended into deep prehistory. Modern foraging populations live in ecological and social contexts influenced by millennia of change, including contact with agricultural neighbors and access to tools not present in earlier eras. While they offer insight, they are not direct windows into life 200,000 years ago. Moreover, even if grandmother assistance improved child survival, the demographic baseline discussed earlier remains relevant. For the grandmother hypothesis to operate, women must survive into post-reproductive years in the first place. If maternal mortality and cumulative physiological stress limited the number of women reaching their late 40s or 50s, then the evolutionary influence of grandmothers would have been carried by a relatively small segment of the population. Selection can operate on small differences, but those differences do not necessarily produce large demographic shifts quickly. Across the long span of human origins in Africa and subsequent dispersal into diverse environments, survival curves likely varied somewhat with climate and resource distribution. In some regions, stable food sources may have supported slightly higher adult survival. In others, harsh conditions may have reduced it. The grandmother hypothesis fits within this variability by suggesting that where older women did survive, their presence mattered. However, it does not imply that grandmothers formed a broad common layer across all early populations. Instead, it offers a mechanism by which extended female lifespan could gradually persist in the gene pool, even if only a minority experienced it at any given time. This perspective reframes the rarity of grandparents. Their scarcity does not contradict evolutionary significance. A trait can be meaningful without being widespread. The existence of some grandmothers may have contributed to lineage stability and knowledge transmission, even if most children grew up without them. In this sense, the grandmother hypothesis highlights a subtle interplay between biology and demography, the possibility of long life emerging within a structure that still kept the upper generational tier narrow for much of human history. To evaluate the grandmother hypothesis more carefully, it is necessary to examine the empirical evidence supporting it and the debates that surround it. Much of the discussion draws from demographic studies of contemporary or historically documented hunter-gatherer societies. In several such populations, researchers have observed correlations between the presence of a living grandmother and improved survival rates among grandchildren. Older women may gather reliable plant foods, especially during seasons when hunting yields fluctuate. They may also provide childcare that allows younger mothers to forage more efficiently. These contributions can increase the nutritional intake and survival probability of offspring. In statistical terms, even a modest increase in child survival linked to grandmother presence could influence reproductive success across generations. From an evolutionary perspective, small advantages accumulated over long time spans can shape species-level traits. However, translating these observations into deep prehistory requires caution. Contemporary foraging groups live in environments shaped by recent climatic stability and varying degrees of interaction with agricultural societies. Their demographic profiles may not fully replicate those of early Homo sapiens populations living tens of thousands of years ago. Moreover, not all studies show equally strong grandmother effects. In some contexts, the survival advantage appears modest or dependent on ecological conditions. Where food sources are abundant and less variable, the relative contribution of an older woman's gathering may be smaller. Where environmental stress is higher, her assistance may be more critical. This variability suggests that the selective pressure favoring extended female lifespan may have fluctuated across regions and time. The hypothesis also intersects with menopause, a relatively rare phenomenon among mammals. Human females often live for decades after reproductive capacity ends. One interpretation is that post-reproductive survival was maintained because it indirectly supported descendants. Yet the demographic baseline discussed earlier remains central. Even if post-reproductive lifespan was biologically possible and occasionally advantageous, the proportion of women reaching those later decades in high mortality environments would still be constrained. A small number of long-lived grandmothers could exert evolutionary influence without creating a broad demographic layer. The difference between evolutionary significance and demographic frequency is crucial. For example, if in a band of 30 individuals 2 women survive into their 50s and contribute to grandchild survival, their genetic lineages might expand more successfully than others. Over thousands of generations, this could preserve or enhance traits associated with longer lifespan. Yet at any single moment in time, those 2 women remain a minority within the group. The archaeological and demographic evidence discussed earlier does not contradict the grandmother hypothesis. It sets boundaries around it. It suggests that while extended female lifespan may have had adaptive value, it did not instantly or uniformly produce populations filled with grandmothers. Across the roughly 200,000 years before substantial reductions in mortality, survival into later decades likely remained limited by environmental risk and cumulative biological strain. The grandmother hypothesis therefore fits within a broader demographic landscape where elders existed but did not dominate. It proposes a mechanism for why human longevity extended beyond reproduction at all, even when survival rates were modest. Yet it does not erase the central structural reality. For most of human history, the presence of grandparents was statistically uncommon, shaped by the same mortality patterns and life history constraints that defined the earliest chapters of Homo sapiens. The grandmother hypothesis invites a broader question about how social roles interact with biological limits. Even if only a minority of women reach post-reproductive age in early human populations, their presence could still alter group dynamics. An older woman who no longer bore children might invest time in food gathering, childcare, conflict mediation, or the transmission of ecological knowledge. In small bands where survival depended on shared memory of seasonal patterns and migration routes, accumulated experience carried value. Yet value does not automatically expand demographic proportions. Social importance can coexist with numerical scarcity. To see this clearly, it helps to imagine the demographic landscape of early Homo sapiens as a terrain shaped by probabilities rather than fixed roles. In a group of 30 individuals, perhaps 1 or 2 older women survived into their late 40s or 50s. Their assistance might increase the survival chances of certain grandchildren. Over many generations, lineages benefiting from such assistance might become more prominent. This gradual process could support the persistence of longer female lifespan traits. However, the overall structure of the population pyramid would remain steep at the base and narrow at the top as long as early mortality and cumulative environmental strain continued. Evolutionary influence operates across thousands of generations, not through sudden expansion. The presence of grandmothers might shape behavior in kin networks without transforming the age distribution overnight. Moreover, the benefits attributed to grandmothers are not uniform across all ecological contexts. In environments where food resources were unpredictable, additional foraging support could make a measurable difference. In more stable ecosystems, the relative advantage might be smaller. Climatic fluctuations during the Pleistocene meant that early human populations experienced alternating periods of abundance and scarcity. Selective pressures linked to post-reproductive support likely varied with these cycles. This variability reinforces the idea that grandmother effects, while potentially meaningful, did not create a universal demographic pattern of extended multi-generational households. Another layer to consider is male longevity. The grandmother hypothesis focuses primarily on women, partly because menopause creates a clear post-reproductive phase. Yet the rarity of grandparents also includes grandfathers. In early populations, men faced additional mortality risks linked to hunting large animals, intergroup conflict, and high mobility. These factors further limited the number of individuals surviving into advanced age. Even if extended female lifespan had adaptive value, male survival patterns would also influence the overall prevalence of grandparents as a social category. Across the long span of human origins in Africa and expansion across continents, The combined effect of maternal risk, environmental stress, and cumulative biological wear kept the upper generational tier modest. The grandmother hypothesis helps explain why extended lifespan did not disappear entirely from the human lineage. It suggests that older women may have contributed to descendant survival in ways that offset some biological costs. Yet it does not overturn the broader demographic structure shaped by mortality patterns. For roughly 80% of human history, the existence of a grandparent depended on multiple fragile links aligning across time. Some lineages experienced that alignment and may have benefited from it. Many did not. The evolutionary story therefore contains both continuity and constraint, a biological capacity for post-reproductive life coexisting with a population structure that rarely allowed it to become common. Around 12,000 years ago, in several regions of the world, human societies began a gradual transition from mobile foraging to more settled forms of food production. This shift toward agriculture is often associated with population growth, permanent villages, and the beginnings of complex social structures. At first glance, it may seem that such changes would immediately increase the number of grandparents. If food could be stored and settlements became stable, perhaps more individuals would survive into later decades. Yet the demographic effects of early agriculture were not straightforward. In many early farming communities, overall health did not improve in the short term. Skeletal evidence from early Neolithic sites in the Near East, Europe, and parts of Asia often shows signs of nutritional stress, reduced stature compared to earlier foragers, and increased prevalence of dental caries. Reliance on a limited number of domesticated crops narrowed dietary diversity. Grain-based diets, while capable of supporting larger populations, sometimes lacked sufficient micronutrients. Periodic crop failures could produce famine conditions within settled communities that were less mobile than their foraging predecessors. Disease patterns also shifted. Permanent settlements brought humans into closer and more sustained contact with domesticated animals. This proximity facilitated the transmission of zoonotic diseases. Larger population densities allowed pathogens to circulate more easily than in small mobile bands. Epidemics that required a minimum population size to sustain transmission could now persist. While agriculture increased total population numbers over time, it did not immediately reduce mortality rates. In fact, early farming communities often experienced higher rates of infectious disease than hunter-gatherers. This paradox is important for understanding the continued rarity of grandparents. Even as birth rates rose in agricultural societies, mortality remained substantial. More children were born, but many still died young. Women often experienced shorter intervals between births compared to mobile foragers, as sedentism and access to stored food reduced the length of breastfeeding. While this increased fertility expanded the base of the population pyramid, it also increased maternal physiological strain. Repeated pregnancies without long recovery periods could exacerbate health risks. Maternal mortality likely remained significant in early agricultural contexts, limiting the number of women who reached advanced age. Archaeological cemeteries from early farming villages often contain large numbers of burials, reflecting population growth. Yet age-at-death distributions frequently continue to show high representation of children and young adults. Although some individuals reached older ages, the proportion of elders did not suddenly expand into a broad demographic layer. The generational ladder may have lengthened slightly in certain contexts, but it remained fragile. To become a grandparent in an early agricultural settlement still required surviving childhood, multiple pregnancies, infectious disease exposure, and decades of physical labor. Farming introduced new forms of work, including repetitive strain from planting, harvesting, grinding grain, and constructing dwellings. Skeletal markers from Neolithic populations show increased joint stress in particular areas, reflecting these labor patterns. These physical demands accumulated over time, influencing long-term survival. When we consider that agriculture began only in the last small fraction of our species' roughly 300,000-year history, the scale of change becomes clearer. For most of human existence, people lived as foragers, with the demographic patterns already described. Even after the agricultural transition, improvements in longevity were gradual and uneven. The presence of grandparents may have become somewhat more common in certain settled communities, but it did not immediately transform family structures across the globe. The deep historical baseline of limited generational overlap persisted well into the agricultural era. As agricultural societies expanded, one of the most visible demographic shifts was a rise in fertility. Sedentary life reduced the need to carry young children over long distances, making it possible for women to have shorter intervals between births. Stored grains and domesticated animals provided more predictable calorie sources compared to seasonal foraging. In many early farming communities, birth rates increased, villages grew larger, population density rose. At first glance, this expansion might seem to create more opportunities for grandparents simply by increasing the number of births within each generation. Yet fertility and longevity do not rise in parallel. A population can grow rapidly while life expectancy remains limited. In fact, early agricultural growth often depended on high fertility offsetting high mortality. Skeletal analyses from Neolithic cemeteries frequently reveal a large proportion of burials belonging to children and young adults. This suggests that although more individuals were born, many did not survive to advanced age. The base of the population pyramid widened significantly, but the upper tiers remained comparatively narrow. In demographic terms, this produces a structure with rapid generational turnover. More children reach adolescence and reproduction than in some foraging contexts, but the cumulative burden of disease and labor continues to restrict long-term survival. Settled life altered disease ecology in fundamental ways. Close quarters, shared water sources, and waste accumulation increased the spread of pathogens. Diseases such as tuberculosis and certain gastrointestinal infections likely became more persistent in denser populations. While small mobile bands might experience outbreaks that burned out quickly, larger settlements allowed infections to circulate continuously. Individuals who survived childhood still faced repeated exposures throughout adulthood. Each infection carried the potential to weaken the body incrementally, especially without medical treatment. These repeated assaults reduced the probability of surviving into late decades. Agricultural labor also introduced new physical demands. Grinding grain with stone tools required repetitive motion that left distinct marks on joints and teeth. Clearing fields, constructing dwellings, and tending animals imposed sustained workloads. Archaeological remains from early farming populations often show increased incidence of joint degeneration and dental decay compared to earlier hunter-gatherers. Diets rich in carbohydrates from cultivated grains contributed to higher rates of cavities and periodontal disease. Untreated dental infections could become systemic threats. The shift from diverse wild foods to more monotonous crop-based diets, while supporting larger populations, sometimes compromised overall health resilience. These factors collectively influenced the structure of generational overlap. Even as the number of children per woman increased, the proportion of individuals surviving into what we would classify as grandparental age did not expand proportionally. To become a grandparent required surviving through childhood, repeated infectious exposures, and decades of labor-intensive adulthood. In early agricultural settings, these hurdles remained substantial. The timeline reinforces the point. Agriculture emerged in multiple regions independently over the last 12,000 years, a brief interval compared to the hundreds of thousands of years preceding it. For the majority of human history, demographic structures resembled those of mobile foragers. Even after the adoption of farming, improvements in adult longevity were slow and uneven across regions. Grandparents may have become somewhat more visible within growing villages, yet they did not suddenly become a dominant demographic group. The transformation of family structure into a stable three-generation norm required further changes that unfolded much later. During the early agricultural era, population growth expanded the base of society far more than it broadened the top. Over time, agricultural societies did not remain static. Techniques improved gradually. Irrigation systems expanded. Crop rotation and animal husbandry became more refined. Trade networks connected distant regions, allowing exchange of goods and sometimes ideas. Yet these developments unfolded across centuries and millennia, not within a single generation. For many early farming communities, daily life remained physically demanding and biologically precarious. The demographic structure that had characterized earlier foraging groups did not disappear overnight. Instead, it shifted slowly, unevenly, and often reversibly in response to environmental pressures, disease outbreaks, and social change. One important factor was famine. Agricultural systems can produce surplus, but they can also fail dramatically. Drought, flood, pests, or soil exhaustion could devastate harvests. In mobile foraging contexts, groups could sometimes relocate to follow alternative food sources. In settled agricultural villages, mobility was reduced. Crop failure meant scarcity concentrated in one place. Historical records from later agricultural societies document repeated famine cycles, and there is no reason to assume early farmers were immune to similar crises. During such periods, mortality could spike across age groups, further narrowing the pool of individuals who might survive into later decades. Another element was intergroup conflict. As settlements grew and resources became tied to specific territories, competition intensified. Archaeological evidence from some Neolithic sites reveals fortifications, mass graves, and trauma consistent with violence. Conflict adds an additional layer of mortality risk, particularly for adults of reproductive and working age. Each loss within these cohorts reduces the number of individuals who might eventually reach grandparental age. While not universal across all early farming societies, episodes of conflict further complicate the path towards stable, multi-generational overlap. Despite these constraints, there were gradual demographic shifts. In certain regions, with favorable climates and relatively stable food production, more individuals began surviving into their 40s and 50s. The proportion of elders may have increased slightly compared to earlier foraging contexts. Yet even in these cases, the change was incremental rather than transformative. The population pyramid broadened at the base much faster than at the top. A village might contain many children and adolescents, more than a typical hunter-gatherer band, but still only a modest number of older adults. To understand the scale, consider the timeline again. Anatomically modern humans have existed for roughly 300,000 years. Agriculture, in its earliest forms, spans only about 12,000 of those years. For nearly 95% of our species' existence, humans lived as foragers with demographic patterns already described. Even within the agricultural era, meaningful expansions of elderly cohorts required improvements in sanitation, medical knowledge, and food security that unfolded much later. Thus, while farming introduced conditions that eventually allowed more people to reach advanced age, it did not immediately overturn the deep demographic structure shaped over hundreds of thousands of years. The rarity of grandparents remained embedded in the population profile through much of early agricultural history. Three-generation households may have appeared more frequently in certain settlements, yet they were not yet the dominant norm across continents. The long arc of demographic change moved slowly. The transition from a world where grandparents were uncommon to one where they became widely expected required further shifts beyond the initial adoption of agriculture. As settlements expanded into towns and early cities, a new demographic pattern began to take shape, one that further complicated the path towards stable grandparenthood. Urbanization increased population density far beyond what small foraging bands or early villages had experienced. In Mesopotamia, the Nile Valley, the Indus region, and later in parts of China and Mesoamerica, clusters of thousands of people began living in close proximity. While such density enabled trade, specialization, and cultural development, it also transformed the ecology of disease. Pathogens that require continuous chains of transmission could now persist within large populations. Infectious diseases spread more easily in crowded dwellings, along shared water sources and through markets. Even if childhood survival improved modestly in some regions due to more stable food supplies, repeated exposure to infectious disease remained a significant cause of mortality. In early urban centers, sanitation infrastructure was limited. Waste disposal systems were often rudimentary. Water sources could become contaminated. Historical and bioarchaeological evidence from ancient cities suggests recurring outbreaks of gastrointestinal infections, respiratory illnesses, and other communicable diseases. The concentration of people created opportunities for pathogens to circulate year after year. This persistent exposure did not spare adults. Individuals who had survived childhood still faced ongoing health risks that could shorten their lifespan before reaching later decades. From a demographic perspective, urbanization did not immediately widen the upper tiers of the population pyramid. Instead, it often intensified mortality patterns, particularly among children and young adults. Burial records from ancient urban cemeteries frequently show high proportions of deaths at relatively young ages. Although some individuals reached older adulthood, the distribution remained uneven. A city might contain more elders in absolute numbers simply because the total population was larger, but proportionally, they did not necessarily represent a dominant demographic layer. This distinction between absolute numbers and relative proportion is essential. A town of 5,000 might include dozens of individuals over 50, yet if hundreds of children and young adults died each generation, the structural balance still favored youth. The generational ladder extended slightly, but it did not become uniformly stable across all households. Urban life also introduced occupational specialization. Some individuals engaged in crafts or administrative roles that were less physically demanding than farming or hunting. In theory, reduced physical strain could support longer survival, yet these advantages were often offset by disease exposure and social inequality. Access to nutrition and protection varied widely within cities. Elites might experience somewhat greater longevity, while laborers and the poor faced harsher conditions. Thus, the emergence of cities created pockets where multi-generational families may have become more visible, particularly among higher status groups. However, across the broader population, mortality remained significant. When we place this within the larger timeline, urbanization occupies an even smaller fraction of human history than agriculture itself. The earliest cities emerged roughly 5,000 to 6,000 years ago. For the overwhelming majority of the roughly 300,000 years since Homo sapiens first appeared, humans lived without urban density. Even after cities formed, the demographic transition toward widespread grandparenthood remained incomplete. The presence of grandparents may have increased gradually in certain regions, yet the structural conditions supporting consistent three-generation overlap were still developing. Disease ecology, population density, and inequality continued to limit the expansion of elderly cohorts within most societies. Beyond disease ecology, early urban societies introduced another factor that influenced generational structure: social stratification. As cities formed, economic roles diversified. Some individuals became administrators, merchants, priests, or skilled artisans. Others labored in fields, construction, or domestic service. This stratification produced uneven access to food quality, shelter, and protection from environmental hazards. Archaeological and historical evidence from ancient civilizations often reveals differences in burial goods, diet composition inferred from isotopic analysis, and skeletal markers of stress between social classes. These differences likely translated into differences in survival probabilities. Members of higher status groups sometimes experience slightly longer lifespans due to improved nutrition and relative insulation from the most physically demanding labor. In contrast, lower status populations faced heavier workloads and poorer living conditions, increasing cumulative biological strain. This uneven distribution of longevity meant that the experience of grandparenthood could vary widely within the same city. In elite households, multi-generational continuity may have been more common. In poorer quarters, mortality patterns may have continued to compress generational overlap. Even where some elders survived into their 50s or 60s, infectious disease remained a persistent threat. Ancient urban cemeteries frequently show evidence of epidemics that affected large segments of the population. When outbreaks occurred, they did not discriminate strictly by age. Adults in their 40s and 50s, who might otherwise have entered a grandparental stage, could succumb alongside children. This recurring vulnerability limited the consistent expansion of the elderly cohort across generations. Another element shaping generational structure in early cities was migration. Urban centers often attracted migrants from surrounding rural areas seeking trade or opportunity. Migration patterns could disrupt family continuity. A young adult who relocated to a city might leave behind aging parents in a village. Even if both generations survived, geographical separation could limit the daily presence of grandparents within the household. Thus, urbanization altered not only mortality rates but also the spatial arrangement of families. The presence of a living grandparent did not always translate into close intergenerational cohabitation. The structure of households became more complex, sometimes incorporating extended kin, sometimes fragmenting them. When viewed over the long arc of human history, urbanization represents a relatively recent and geographically limited development. For most of our species' existence, humans lived in small groups where family proximity was inherent to survival. Yet even in those smaller groups, mortality patterns limited the number of elders. In cities, larger populations increased the absolute number of older individuals but did not immediately transform the proportional balance. The top of the population pyramid broadened only gradually. What becomes clear is that demographic expansion and structural stability are not the same. Cities could house thousands of people, but without sustained reductions in infectious disease and improvements in nutrition and sanitation, the survival curve remained steep in early life and declined steadily thereafter. The result was a society where grandparents were more visible in some strata and regions, yet still not a universal or dominant presence. The shift toward a world in which most children could expect to know their grandparents required changes that extended beyond the formation of cities themselves. As urban societies matured across different regions, incremental improvements in organization began to influence public health, though often unevenly. Some ancient cities developed rudimentary drainage systems, designated waste areas, and more structured water management. In parts of the Roman Empire, aqueducts and sewer systems presented significant engineering achievements. In certain areas of South Asia and the Mediterranean, archaeological remains show evidence of planned streets and water channels. These developments suggest growing awareness of environmental management, yet their effectiveness varied widely, and they did not eliminate disease as a structural force shaping mortality. Even in relatively advanced urban centers, outbreaks of epidemic disease periodically reshaped population profiles. Historical records from later antiquity describe waves of illness that reduced populations significantly. Although precise mortality rates are debated, the pattern is clear. Cities remained vulnerable to rapid demographic contraction. When epidemics struck, they often disrupted generational continuity. Adults who had survived childhood and reached middle age could die within months, interrupting the chain required for stable grandparenthood. Improvements in infrastructure could moderate everyday mortality, but they did not fully protect older cohorts from sudden shocks. Another factor influencing longevity in urban contexts was nutrition. Trade networks allowed the movement of grain, oil, salt, and other staples across regions. This increased resilience against localized crop failure. However, access to traded goods was not equally distributed. Wealthier households might enjoy varied diets and relative food security, while poorer residents remained vulnerable to shortages. Nutritional inequality translated into uneven survival probabilities. Some families may have maintained 3 living generations for longer periods, especially in stable and prosperous regions. Others experienced repeated losses that kept the generational ladder short. When considering the larger timescale, it is important to recognize how recent sustained improvements in mortality truly are. Even in ancient civilizations known for engineering and governance, life expectancy at birth remained low by modern standards, largely because of persistent child mortality and infectious disease. While a portion of adults survived into later decades, they did not constitute a broad majority. Multi-generational households existed, but they were not yet structurally guaranteed for most families. The demographic transformation that would make grandparents widely expected required reductions in child mortality and adult mortality that were more systematic and widespread than ancient infrastructure alone could achieve. Across the several thousand years of early urban history, mortality patterns fluctuated with war, famine, trade disruption, and epidemic. The upper tiers of the population pyramid broadened in certain periods and contracted in others. Stability at the top remained fragile. When we place this against the backdrop of roughly 300,000 years of human existence, urbanization represents a brief chapter in which incremental change began, but did not yet redefine generational structure. Grandparents became somewhat more common in some regions, yet their presence remained shaped by vulnerability. The demographic baseline established in earlier epochs, youth-heavy populations with thinning older cohorts continued to exert influence. The shift toward a world in which most children reliably encountered living grandparents was still unfolding, and it would depend on transformations not yet fully realized in the ancient urban era. If we move forward into the late medieval and early modern periods in different parts of the world, a gradual demographic shift begins to take clearer shape. This shift did not occur everywhere at once, nor did it unfold uniformly. Yet across certain regions, improvements in agriculture, trade stability, and local governance began to moderate some of the mortality pressures that had long defined human populations. Crop rotation techniques, expanded irrigation, and the introduction of new food plants from distant continents slowly diversified diets. In Europe, for example, the spread of crops such as the potato in the early modern era provided caloric resilience against grain failure. In parts of Asia, rice cultivation techniques increased yields in densely populated areas. These agricultural developments did not eliminate famine, but they sometimes reduced its frequency or severity in stable periods. At the same time, gradual improvements in local sanitation and urban organization, though limited by modern standards, began to affect survival rates modestly. The key demographic turning point was not simply increased food production, but a slow decline in child mortality in certain regions. Even small reductions in infant and early childhood deaths have profound structural consequences. When more children survive into adolescence and adulthood, the base of the population pyramid stabilizes rather than repeatedly collapsing. Over time, this stabilization allows more individuals to progress through the generational ladder. If those individuals also experience modest gains in adult survival due to improved nutrition or reduced conflict, the upper tiers begin to widen. The effect remains gradual, yet it compounds across generations. Historical parish records and early census data from parts of Europe and East Asia suggest that by the 17th and 18th centuries, a growing minority of adults were living into their 50s and beyond. This does not mean that grandparents suddenly became universal. Mortality remained high by modern standards, and epidemics such as plague or smallpox periodically reversed gains. However, the proportion of individuals reaching ages compatible with grandparenthood increased in certain regions. Three-generation households became more visible, especially in rural settings where land and labor were organized around family continuity. In these contexts, grandparents sometimes played economic roles, managing property, supervising work, or caring for young children while middle generations labored in fields. Yet this demographic expansion was uneven across the globe. Many regions continue to experience high mortality due to war, famine, and epidemic disease. Colonial expansion and the spread of new pathogens caused catastrophic population declines in some parts of the Americas and Oceania. The demographic transition toward widespread grandparenthood was therefore fragmented and reversible. When we situate this development within the broader timeline of human existence, it remains a relatively recent phenomenon. For nearly 300,000 years, survival curves remained steep in early life and thinned steadily thereafter. Only in the last few centuries did certain populations begin to see consistent increases in both child survival and adult longevity. This combination is crucial. Increased fertility alone does not produce grandparents as a common presence. Sustained improvements in survival across multiple life stages do. In the early modern era, the structural possibility of widespread grandparenthood began to emerge more clearly in some societies. The generational ladder lengthened slowly, rung by rung, yet it was not yet secure everywhere. The demographic transformation that would make grandparents an expected feature of family life was still incomplete, poised on the threshold of further change. During the 18th and 19th centuries in parts of Europe, East Asia, and later North America, demographic change accelerated in ways that would eventually transform the generational structure of families. Historians and demographers often refer to this long process as the demographic transition. Its early phase did not begin with dramatic medical breakthroughs, but with gradual shifts in living conditions. Agricultural productivity continued to improve, transportation networks expanded, allowing grain and other staples to move more efficiently between regions. In some cities, basic public health measures emerged, including organized waste removal and cleaner water sources. These developments were uneven and often incomplete, yet they began to influence survival patterns in measurable ways. One of the most significant changes was a steady reduction in infant and child mortality in certain regions. Even before the widespread adoption of modern antibiotics, improvements in nutrition, breastfeeding practices, and small-scale sanitation reduced the frequency of fatal infections among young children. Vaccination against smallpox, introduced in the late 18th century, provided one of the first systematic public health interventions capable of lowering mortality on a broad scale. As more children survived into adolescence and adulthood, the base of the population pyramid stabilized more firmly than in earlier centuries. When this stabilization combined with modest gains in adult survival, the generational ladder lengthened in a more durable way. Adults who would previously have died in their 30s or 40s increasingly survived into their 50s and 60s. This shift did not eliminate mortality from disease or hardship, but it changed the statistical balance. The proportion of individuals reaching ages compatible with grandparenthood expanded gradually. Parish records and civil registries from the 19th century in some European regions show rising life expectancy at birth, driven largely by declines in early mortality. Importantly, life expectancy at age 20 or 30 also began to increase, meaning that adults had a growing probability of surviving into later decades. The cumulative effect of these changes was structural rather than anecdotal. In households where 2 generations previously might have overlapped briefly or not at all, 3 generations could now coexist for longer periods. Grandparents became more visible not only as individuals but as a demographic layer. In rural communities, they often contributed to childcare, agricultural management, and the preservation of family property. In urban settings, industrialization altered family arrangements, sometimes separating generations geographically. Yet even there, the probability that a child had at least one living grandparent rose compared to earlier centuries. This transformation, however, was neither immediate nor universal. Many regions of the world continued to experience high mortality well into the 19th century. Epidemics such as cholera, influenza, and tuberculosis remained significant threats. War and political upheaval disrupted demographic gains. The demographic transition unfolded unevenly across continents, influenced by economic development, governance, and access to public health measures. When we place this era within the broader human timeline, it occupies only a narrow slice of our species' existence. For the vast majority of the roughly 300,000 years since Homo sapiens first appeared, survival into grandparental age remained limited. Only in the last few centuries did sustained reductions in early mortality and incremental improvements in adult survival begin to make grandparents a common expectation in certain societies. The structure of time within families was changing, but the shift was still in motion. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries in several industrializing regions, the cumulative effects of public health reform, improved nutrition, and expanding medical knowledge began to reshape the demographic landscape more decisively. Clean water systems reduced the spread of waterborne diseases. Organized sewage infrastructure limited contamination in densely populated areas. Pasteurization of milk and better food handling practices lowered the incidence of certain infections among infants and children. Although antibiotics were not yet widely available until the mid-20th century, even incremental reductions in exposure to pathogens had measurable effects on survival. One of the most important structural shifts during this period was the sustained decline in infant and child mortality. When fewer children died in the first years of life, the statistical foundation of the population pyramid changed profoundly. Instead of a wide base repeatedly thinned by early loss, more individuals advanced steadily into adolescence and adulthood. This stabilization allowed the upper tiers to expand gradually as well. Adults who survived childhood now had a greater chance of living into their 50s and 60s, especially as nutrition improved and labor conditions slowly reformed in certain regions. Industrialization initially introduced new hazards, including factory injuries and urban crowding. Yet over time, labor regulations, safer working environments, and expanding medical care began to mitigate some of these risks. Life expectancy at birth rose steadily in countries undergoing sustained economic development. More importantly, for the question of grandparents, life expectancy at age 40 or 50 also began to increase. This meant that once individuals reached midlife, they had a higher probability of surviving into later decades. The generational ladder, once fragile and narrow at the top, began to widen in a way not previously seen in human history. Historical demographic data from the early 20th century show a rising proportion of individuals living beyond 60 in several industrialized nations. This did not mean that all families experienced 3-generation overlap equally. Poverty, regional inequality, and limited access to healthcare continued to create disparities. Yet compared to earlier centuries, the likelihood that a child would know at least one grandparent increased significantly. The demographic transformation was no longer confined to isolated pockets. It was becoming systemic in certain parts of the world. When viewed against the full span of approximately 300,000 years of Homo sapiens existence, this shift occupies only the most recent fraction. For the overwhelming majority of human history, the structural barriers discussed earlier, high child mortality, maternal risk, infectious disease, cumulative biological strain kept the upper generational tier modest. Only in the last 1 or 2 centuries did a combination of public health, sanitation, vaccination, and economic change begin to produce a sustained expansion of older age cohorts across large populations. The presence of grandparents transitioned from being statistically uncommon to increasingly expected within many societies. This turning point does not erase the deep evolutionary and demographic background from which it emerged. Instead, it highlights how recent and rapid the change has been. The world in which most children reliably encounter living grandparents is historically new, layered atop a long past in which that overlap was uncertain and often rare. The 20th century marked a turning point in human demographic history that had no true precedent in the previous hundreds of thousands of years. Medical science, public health systems, and technological infrastructure converged to reduce mortality in ways that were both systematic and sustained. Vaccination campaigns expanded beyond smallpox to include diseases such as diphtheria, tetanus, and later measles and polio. The discovery and widespread use of antibiotics in the mid-20th century transformed the treatment of bacterial infections that had previously been common causes of death. Clean water access, pasteurization, refrigeration, and improved obstetric care dramatically lowered both infant and maternal mortality. These changes did not eliminate death or illness, but they altered the survival curve at multiple points along the lifespan. One of the most significant effects was the steep decline in child mortality across many industrialized and later developing nations. When infants and young children survive at much higher rates, the base of the population pyramid stabilizes and matures rather than collapsing each generation. At the same time, improved treatment of infections and better management of chronic conditions extended adult survival. Heart disease, once often fatal at earlier ages, became more manageable with medication and surgical intervention. Obstetric care reduced the risk of childbirth complications that had long threatened women's lives. The cumulative impact of these changes widened the upper tiers of the population pyramid in a way never before sustained on a global scale. For the first time in human history, large proportions of individuals in certain societies could expect to live into their 60s and 70s. This expansion reshaped family structure. Grandparenthood shifted from being a statistical possibility to a common life stage. Multi-generational overlap became the norm rather than the exception in many countries. Children grew up with living grandparents as part of everyday experience. The demographic ladder, once fragile and often 2 rungs high, now regularly supported 3 and sometimes 4 overlapping generations. This transformation did not occur simultaneously across the world. Regions affected by war, poverty, or limited healthcare access experienced slower transitions. Yet even in many developing nations, public health interventions eventually reduced child mortality significantly. The global life expectancy at birth rose dramatically over the course of the 20th century. More important for our question, life expectancy at age 50 also increased, meaning that individuals who reached midlife had a much greater chance of becoming grandparents. When we contrast this with the long arc of our species' existence, the scale of change becomes striking. For roughly 80% of human history, mortality patterns shaped by environment and biology limited the number of elders within each community. In the span of a few generations, technological and medical innovation altered that balance. The presence of grandparents expanded not through slow evolutionary change, but through rapid environmental modification created by human knowledge and infrastructure. The body that evolved in high-risk Pleistocene landscapes now lives within systems that buffer many of those risks. The demographic result is a population structure that would have been unfamiliar to most of our ancestors. Grandparents, once rare in proportion, have become a visible and widespread demographic layer within modern societies. As mortality declined across multiple age groups in the 20th century, another structural shift followed. Fertility rates began to fall in many industrialized societies. Families had fewer children, yet those children were far more likely to survive into adulthood. This combination, low mortality and lower fertility, reshaped the population pyramid from a broad-based triangle into a more rectangular form. Instead of a structure dominated by youth, societies began to show balanced proportions across age groups, with a growing segment of older adults. This transition altered not only the number of grandparents, but also their duration within family life. When life expectancy rises, the period between becoming a grandparent and entering advanced old age extends. A woman who becomes a grandmother at 50 might now expect to live for several additional decades. The overlap between generations lengthens. In many modern societies, it is common for individuals to experience grandparenthood for 20 or 30 years. Such extended overlap was exceedingly rare across most of human history. The decline in fertility also changed the density of kin networks. Earlier populations often had many siblings and cousins, though high mortality limited survival into later decades. Modern families tend to be smaller, yet because survival is high, the intergenerational connections that do exist persist for longer spans. A child may have fewer cousins but more living grandparents and even great-grandparents. The structure of kinship becomes vertically extended rather than horizontally crowded. This vertical expansion is a defining feature of contemporary demographic patterns. Advances in chronic disease management further contributed to this shift. Conditions that once shortened lives in mid-adulthood, such as hypertension, diabetes, and certain heart conditions, became more treatable. Screening programs and preventive care extended functional years. While not eliminating aging or illness, these interventions increased the probability that individuals who reach middle age would continue into later decades with sufficient health to participate in family life. This increased survival after reproduction reinforced the presence of grandparents as a stable demographic group. The transformation is visible in life expectancy statistics. In many countries, life expectancy at birth rose from under 50 years in the early 20th century to over 70 or 80 years by its end. More relevant still, survival beyond 60 became common rather than exceptional. The generational ladder that once frequently broke after 2 rungs now regularly extended to 3 and sometimes 4. When placed against the broader evolutionary timeline, this demographic structure is extraordinarily recent. For hundreds of thousands of years, generational overlap was compressed by high early mortality and cumulative biological risk. The human body evolved within that compressed framework. Only in the last century did technological and medical systems buffer mortality sufficiently to expand the upper tiers consistently across large populations. Grandparenthood shifted from a possibility dependent on fragile alignment of survival probabilities to a predictable life stage in many societies. This does not imply uniformity across the globe. Regions affected by conflict, inequality, and limited healthcare access still experience uneven mortality patterns. Yet the overall global trend across the 20th century has been toward increased longevity and extended generational overlap. The demographic landscape in which grandparents are widespread is not an ancient constant, but a recent construction built upon infrastructure, medicine, and sustained public health effort. As the 20th century progressed into the 21st, the expansion of older age cohorts became one of the defining features of global population structure. In many countries, improvements in sanitation, vaccination, maternal care, and chronic disease management produced sustained gains in life expectancy across multiple generations. This did not simply increase the number of elderly individuals, it changed the rhythm of family life. Grandparenthood extended over longer spans, and in some cases, individuals experienced great-grandparenthood as a common stage rather than an exception. Demographers describe this shift as population aging, a process in which the proportion of older adults grows relative to younger age groups. The pyramid that once tapered sharply at the top gradually became more column-like, and in certain societies even inverted, with fewer births and more older individuals. This structural transformation has no close parallel in the deep past of Homo sapiens. For most of the roughly 300,000 years since our species first appeared in Africa, mortality patterns kept the upper tiers narrow. Now, in some regions, individuals over 60 or 70 form a substantial segment of the population. The presence of grandparents is no longer a statistical rarity, but a demographic expectation. In many societies, children routinely grow up with multiple living grandparents and sometimes great-grandparents. This expanded overlap alters social roles and economic arrangements. Older adults may contribute through childcare, financial support, and transmission of cultural memory. At the same time, longer lifespans bring new challenges related to chronic disease and dependency in very old age. The extended duration of grandparenthood is therefore intertwined with healthcare systems, pension structures, and shifting family norms. Yet even as longevity increases, inequality continues to shape outcomes. Life expectancy differs significantly across regions and socioeconomic groups. Access to medical care, nutrition, and stable housing influences survival probabilities. While global averages have risen, not all populations experience the same degree of extended generational overlap. This uneven distribution reminds us that the widespread presence of grandparents depends on sustained infrastructure and stability. When health systems falter or conflict disrupts society, mortality patterns can regress. The historical novelty of today's demographic structure becomes clearer when we step back to the long evolutionary scale. For approximately 80% of human history, the existence of grandparents was constrained by early mortality, maternal risk, infectious disease, and cumulative biological wear. The transformation that made grandparenthood common unfolded within just a few recent generations. It did not arise from rapid genetic evolution, but from environmental modification driven by human knowledge. The body that once navigated Pleistocene landscapes now benefits from antibiotics, surgical intervention, and public health systems that buffer risk across the lifespan. The result is a world in which multi-generational households are frequent and extended. This condition feels ordinary because it surrounds us, yet in the context of deep time, it represents an unprecedented demographic configuration. Grandparents, once statistically uncommon across vast stretches of human history, have become a visible and enduring layer in many modern societies. As grandparents became a stable and widespread presence in many modern societies, their role within families began to shift in ways that would have been unfamiliar across most of human history. In earlier eras, when survival into later decades was uncertain, older individuals who did live longer often continued working as long as their bodies allowed. There was little formal distinction between productive adulthood and retirement. In contrast, the 20th century introduced pension systems, retirement norms, and social policies that separated older adulthood from full-time economic labor. This separation created a new social space in which grandparents could invest time differently. Instead of being defined primarily by subsistence labor, they could become more visibly involved in childcare, storytelling, and the transmission of memory. This change reflects a broader transformation in the structure of time within human life. When longevity increases and fertility decreases, the span between generations expands. Parents may have fewer children, but they often have living parents of their own for decades. The presence of grandparents becomes embedded in daily routines, school schedules, and caregiving arrangements. In some societies, grandparents provide regular childcare that enables parents to participate in the workforce. In others, they serve as custodians of cultural practices, language, and family history. The continuity they offer is not merely biological but narrative. Stories can now pass across 3 or 4 living generations, creating a sense of historical depth within the household. From a demographic perspective, this layered structure represents a departure from the compressed generational overlap that characterized most of Homo sapiens' existence. When 3 or more generations coexist reliably, family systems adapt around that expectation. Legal systems recognize inheritance patterns that assume extended lifespan. Housing arrangements sometimes accommodate older relatives. Social identities shift to include life stages such as retired grandparent, a category that would have been rare in deep prehistory. The body that evolved in environments of persistent risk now lives within networks that support prolonged survival and social engagement beyond reproductive years. Yet this expanded role is not uniform across cultures. In some regions, economic pressures require older adults to continue laboring well into later life. In others, institutional care replaces intergenerational cohabitation. Urbanization and migration can separate grandparents from grandchildren geographically, even when both survive into advanced age. Thus, the demographic possibility of widespread grandparenthood does not automatically produce identical social arrangements. It creates potential, which each society organizes differently. When we reflect on the scale of change, the novelty becomes apparent. For hundreds of thousands of years, survival into grandparental age depended on fragile alignment across biological and environmental factors. Now, in many parts of the world, grandparenthood is anticipated as a normal phase of life. Children may grow up assuming that their parents' will be present for milestones such as schooling or adolescence. This expectation shapes emotional bonds and long-term planning. The presence of grandparents is no longer an exceptional extension of survival, but a predictable component of family structure in numerous societies. This transformation, rooted in demographic transition and medical innovation, has redefined the social meaning of aging within the human lifespan. The expansion of grandparenthood in modern societies has also altered how knowledge moves across time. In small foraging bands of deep prehistory, knowledge was transmitted primarily within one or two overlapping generations. Skills related to hunting, gathering, tool-making, and navigation were taught directly from parents to children, sometimes supplemented by a small number of elders. When elders were few, the living memory of past events extended back only a limited distance. Stories could persist through oral tradition, yet the number of people who personally remembered distant decades was small. In contemporary societies with extended lifespans, the situation is different. A child may grow up with access to 3 generations of living memory: parents who recall recent decades, grandparents who remember mid-century events, and sometimes great-grandparents who experienced even earlier historical moments. This layering of lived memory changes the texture of family identity. Events are not only written in books, but embodied in people who can recount them firsthand. From a demographic standpoint, this vertical continuity reflects the widening of the upper tiers of the population pyramid. When more individuals survive into their 70s and 80s, the span of collective memory within a single family lengthens. This has subtle psychological and social consequences. Decisions about education, career, and migration may be influenced by the presence of elders who witness different economic systems or social norms. Cultural practices can be reinforced through repeated interaction across decades. At the same time, the accumulation of multiple generations within one household or extended network introduces new dynamics. Differences in worldview, shaped by distinct historical periods, coexist within close proximity. The existence of grandparents as a common demographic layer creates space for dialogue across time within families. This condition contrasts sharply with the demographic structure that dominated most of human history. When mortality patterns limited survival into advanced age, the living bridge to earlier decades was narrower. Cultural transmission depended heavily on immediate parental guidance and the limited number of elders who survived. The expansion of longevity in the last 1 or 2 centuries has therefore increased not only the number of grandparents but the density of intergenerational memory. Yet this density is contingent on sustained survival. It depends on healthcare systems, nutrition, and social stability that buffer individuals against the cumulative risks that once curtailed lifespan. In regions where conflict, disease, or inequality undermine these buffers, generational overlap can contract again. The demographic structure that makes grandparents common is not guaranteed by biology alone. It is supported by infrastructure and policy as much as by evolutionary inheritance. When viewed against the deep timeline of Homo sapiens, the modern experience of extended family memory appears recent and contingent. For roughly 80% of our species' existence, the generational ladder was often short, with limited overlap between grandparents and grandchildren. The widening of that ladder in contemporary societies has reshaped how humans perceive continuity, responsibility, and identity across time. Grandparents are now woven into the narrative fabric of many families in ways that would have been statistically uncommon for most of human history. The widespread presence of grandparents in modern societies has also reshaped how responsibility and dependency are distributed across generations. For most of human history, survival into later decades was uncertain, and the number of older individuals within a group remained small. Care flowed primarily downward, from parents to children, with only occasional extension upward toward aging relatives. In contemporary settings, where longevity is extended and fertility is often lower, care moves in multiple directions at once. Adults may support children and aging parents simultaneously. Grandparents may provide childcare while also receiving medical care in later years. This layered reciprocity reflects the expansion of generational overlap made possible by modern survival patterns. From a demographic perspective, this structure is the product of sustained reductions in mortality across childhood and adulthood. When individuals routinely survive into their 70s and beyond, the proportion of older adults within the population grows. Societies adapt by creating retirement systems, healthcare institutions, and legal frameworks that recognize aging as a predictable life stage. These adaptations reinforce the presence of grandparents as a stable demographic group. Yet they also introduce new pressures. Extended lifespan increases the years during which chronic conditions may require management. The social and economic systems that support aging populations become central to family life. In this context, grandparenthood is no longer defined solely by biological overlap with grandchildren. It is embedded within institutional arrangements that did not exist across most of Homo sapiens' history. The contrast with deep prehistory remains striking. In the small bands of early humans, the demographic pyramid was steep, and the number of elders limited. Care networks existed, as evidenced by skeletal remains showing healed injuries and survival despite physical impairment. Yet these networks operated within tight margins of survival probability. Modern societies, by buffering mortality through medicine and infrastructure, have expanded those margins significantly. The presence of grandparents as an expected stage of life is therefore both a demographic achievement and a structural commitment. It depends on continuous investment in health, sanitation, and social stability. This expanded generational structure also influences how individuals imagine their own future. In many contemporary cultures, people anticipate becoming grandparents as part of a predictable life course. Planning for retirement, housing, and intergenerational support assumes a level of longevity that would have been rare across most of human existence. This expectation shapes personal identity and long-term decision-making. When we step back to the scale of roughly 300,000 years of Homo sapiens history, the novelty of this expectation becomes clear. For the vast majority of that span, the chain from child to parent to grandparent was fragile, frequently broken by early mortality and environmental risk. Only in the last few generations has that chain become structurally reinforced across large populations. The social meaning of grandparenthood has expanded because the demographic conditions supporting it have expanded. What once depended on exceptional alignment of survival probabilities now rests on systematic public health and technological infrastructure. The presence of grandparents, woven deeply into modern family life, stands as a recent chapter in a much longer story shaped by vulnerability, adaptation, and change. When we look back across the long arc of human history, the presence of grandparents appears less like a constant feature of family life and more like a recent demographic configuration layered upon a much older biological foundation. For roughly 300,000 years, Homo sapiens lived within ecological systems that imposed persistent mortality risks. Childhood vulnerability, maternal danger, infectious disease, cumulative physical strain, famine, and conflict shaped survival curves generation after generation. In that landscape, the overlap required for stable three-generation families was possible but statistically limited. The upper tier of the population pyramid remained narrow for most communities. Elders existed, sometimes resilient and deeply valued, yet they did not form a broad demographic plateau. In the last few centuries, and especially in the last 100 years, human societies altered that structure through deliberate environmental modification. Clean water, vaccination, antibiotics, improved obstetric care, and chronic disease management reduced mortality at multiple life stages. As child survival increased and adult longevity expanded, the generational ladder lengthened in a sustained way. Grandparents moved from the margins of probability into the center of expectation. This transformation was not driven by rapid genetic evolution, but by cultural, technological, and institutional change. The human body remains fundamentally similar to that of our Pleistocene ancestors. What differs is the surrounding system that buffers risk. This distinction carries implications for how we understand aging today. The biological processes of cellular wear, immune decline, and metabolic change continue to operate as they always have. Medicine and infrastructure mitigate many consequences, yet they do not eliminate aging itself. The expansion of grandparenthood reflects an environment that supports prolonged survival, not a body redesigned from the ground up. In this sense, modern demographic structure is layered upon evolutionary foundations that were shaped under very different conditions. When we consider that for approximately 80% of human history, the presence of grandparents was uncommon, the rapid expansion of elderly cohorts in modern societies takes on a different perspective. It is not simply a natural unfolding of human lifespan, but the result of sustained collective effort. Public health systems, education, sanitation, and economic stability all contribute to maintaining the conditions under which extended generational overlap can persist. Where these supports weaken, mortality patterns can shift again. The stability of grandparenthood as a widespread life stage depends on ongoing maintenance of the systems that made it possible. At the same time, the existence of extended multi-generational families offers opportunities that were rare across most of our species' existence. Knowledge can accumulate across living decades. Emotional bonds can stretch across 3 or 4 generations. The sense of continuity within a family can deepen when elders remain present for longer spans. Yet this continuity is historically recent. For most of human time, children grew up primarily within 2 overlapping generations, navigating a world in which long-lived elders were exceptions rather than norms. Recognizing this contrast invites a quieter reflection. The demographic landscape we inhabit is not timeless. It is a fragile and recent configuration built upon a deep history in which survival beyond reproductive years was never guaranteed. When we recognize how recent widespread grandparenthood truly is, another layer of meaning begins to emerge. For most of our species' existence, life unfolded within a narrow window shaped by early mortality and cumulative risk. The expectation of seeing one's grandchildren grow was uncertain, dependent on alignment across fragile links of survival. In contrast, modern societies often treat extended lifespan as a default. Policies, housing design, retirement planning, and even childhood imagination assume that grandparents will be present for many years. This shift influences how time itself is experienced. The human life course, once compressed, has lengthened. Childhood, adulthood, and later life are now more distinctly segmented phases, each with social roles and expectations. Grandparenthood occupies a defined stage within this extended arc. From an evolutionary standpoint, this arrangement overlays cultural design onto biological capacity. The human organism evolved in environments where long post-reproductive lifespan was possible but not consistently realized for the majority. Today, that biological potential is supported by institutions that sustain survival into advanced age. This support, however, is contingent. It relies on stable food systems, functioning healthcare, education, and relative peace. When any of these pillars weaken, mortality patterns can shift. History reminds us that demographic gains are not irreversible. Epidemics, war, economic collapse, and environmental disruption have repeatedly altered population structures. The broad presence of grandparents in many contemporary societies reflects a period of relative stability and sustained public health investment. It is not an inherent guarantee written into our evolutionary code. At the same time, extended generational overlap offers opportunities that were rarely available across deep time. 3 or 4 living generations can share resources, perspectives, and emotional support. Children may grow within networks that provide both immediate care and historical depth. Elders can contribute accumulated knowledge while also witnessing the unfolding of lives shaped by new technologies and ideas. This vertical continuity expands the human experience beyond what was common for most of our ancestors. Yet it also introduces responsibility. Supporting aging populations requires collective commitment. The systems that sustain longevity must be maintained and adapted as societies change. The presence of grandparents as a widespread demographic layer is therefore both a gift and an obligation. It arises from centuries of cumulative effort in sanitation, medicine, and social organization. When we step back to the scale of hundreds of thousands of years, the transformation appears swift and profound. For the overwhelming majority of human history, the generational ladder was short, often 2 rungs high. Only recently has it extended reliably to 3 or more. This extension invites reflection rather than certainty. The structure we inhabit is historically new, built upon foundations shaped in harsher conditions. Understanding that contrast allows us to see grandparenthood not as a timeless constant, but as a chapter within a longer story of vulnerability, adaptation, and deliberate change. When the long history of human survival is placed beside the present, a quiet contrast remains. For hundreds of thousands of years, the human story unfolded within narrow margins. Birth was uncertain, childhood was fragile, adulthood required endurance. Aging was possible, sometimes meaningful, yet never structurally guaranteed for large portions of the population. The demographic shape of early Homo sapiens reflected this reality: a wide base of youth, a steady thinning through adulthood, and a narrow crest of elders. Within that crest, some individuals became grandparents, but their presence depended on alignment across multiple vulnerable stages. That alignment was statistically rare across most of our species' existence. In the last few generations, the structure changed. Mortality receded in early life. Medical care buffered infections and injury. Food systems stabilized caloric intake across seasons. The upper tiers of the population pyramid widened. Grandparents became visible not as exceptions but as a demographic layer embedded in everyday life. Children now often grow up expecting the steady presence of older relatives. The generational ladder extends upward in ways that would have been unfamiliar to most of our ancestors. Yet the biological organism beneath this structure remains shaped by deep time. The processes of aging, cellular wear, and metabolic change are not inventions of modernity. They are part of the evolutionary inheritance forged in landscapes where long post-reproductive survival was uncommon. Modern society overlays that inheritance with protection and infrastructure, allowing many individuals to move beyond the limits that once curtailed lifespan. This overlay is powerful, but it is also contingent. It depends on sustained public health systems, education, economic stability, and social cooperation. When these conditions are disrupted, mortality patterns can shift again. The presence of grandparents as a widespread life stage is therefore not simply a natural endpoint of evolution. It is a historical development achieved through cumulative human effort. Understanding this does not diminish its value. Instead, it clarifies its rarity in the context of deep time. For approximately 80% of human history, most children would not have known multiple living grandparents. The expectation of extended generational overlap is recent, measured in centuries rather than millennia. Recognizing this invites a different way of seeing the present. The existence of grandparents around us is not an ancient constant carried unchanged across ages. It is the outcome of demographic transition layered upon evolutionary foundations shaped in more fragile conditions. As we consider the long arc from early Homo sapiens in Africa to modern global societies, the question remains open rather than closed. If the structure that now feels ordinary is historically new, how will it continue to evolve as environments, technologies, and health systems change?